So, I haven't put up a video in a very long time, or a stream, because I have been having internet problems, and I am in the process of moving. So, hopefully, by the end of the month, all of the internet stuff will be settled, and I'll be able to record on a more regular basis. This is also going to tie into the first part of the video that I want to talk about, which is that the ultimate issue that this game has in terms of balance has to do with matchmaking. More so than the actual balance of the game. The first thing that I want to highlight, if you look at my account level and spirit points, that total hasn't changed in almost a month. And what happened was, the middle of October, right around the release of Mia, David, and the Plaguebringer, my internet in my building went to absolute crap. And they wasted a lot of my time. I couldn't grind them up. Then, with the release of the Blacksmith, my internet was a bit more stable, and I was able to play for a month. I got through the free week on Epic Games, I got through the Blacksmith, I got to the Prestige system, I started grinding that, and I was able to build my account level up. And at the beginning of December, for end of the first week, beginning of the second week of December, my internet shifts the bed again. And it's been continued that way. And every attempt that I have tried to make to play this game ends terribly. Hence why I've seen no progress. Now, the play time that I have in this game is good enough, which would put me at the higher end of matchmaking. However, albeit more survivor-sided than demon-sided, however, my account level looks like somebody that picked up the game, you know, during the free week and has been playing non-stop since then, or somebody who's been just casually playing every now and then, which is true. Here's the issue that this game has, though. Let's say I get into a game. I go to queue. As a solo queue survivor, the game experience is a giant pendulum from either terrible, where there's either I'm DCing, or multiple people on the team are DCing, all the way to a good game where you get a good group of survivors, you get a demon that you can work around. I say that because that can swing wildly from a team that doesn't work well together, but a demon that doesn't know what you're doing, so the survivors win. A demon that knows exactly what they're doing, but the survivors are actually competent enough for it to be a good challenge. Or you get a good demon that kind of goes easy on you, so to speak. So matchmaking is terrible. And every time I go to queue for a match, as multiple people, I'll get to the party screen, which I've only been able to secure one other person. As soon as I hit matchmaking, I'm sitting in queue for a minimum of 10 minutes. Even in solo queue, I'm sitting in queues for 10 minutes. Now, part of it has to do with the time of day that you choose to play, but I can't always play during peak hours. So I'm fine with, like right now, it's 2 in the morning as I record the video. If I were to sit in queue for 10 to 15 minutes right now, I'd have no problem with that. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, on a weekday, yes, that might be your problem that it's a weekday, but 5 o'clock in the afternoon, you mean to tell me that a 2-stack can't get a game in under 15 minutes? Just a game. Then the next issue is when you get into the collection screen, or when you get into a game lobby, then you get a couple of things that happen. You get people who are randomly AFK for a good 60 seconds on the timer, so somebody leaves, restarts the whole queue again. You get a demon that you know, and so you're like, I don't want to fight that guy, I'll pull out, I'll avoid him. Or you get a demon that is like an absurdly high level, and the rest of the survivors on your team are so underleveled, you know you're going to get crushed. It is not uncommon for me to, when I get a queue, get between a 300 and 600 account level demon, and the survivors on my team are me at 100 and change, and 2 survivors below 100, and maybe 1 that's in the 100 to 300 range. I've never seen a survivor, by the way, that has had over an account level over 350. I've never seen one when I queue. The only things I've seen above 350 are on that demon side. So then you have the revolving door of people DCing, myself included. I am guilty on this, but, I mean, I don't really have an excuse for it. I'm part of the problem. But once that lobby gets closed for the first time, you're in queue for another 10 to 15 minutes. I've had queues of 30 plus minutes of just sitting here with my controller down for 30 minutes doing paperwork in the background, working on packing, helping people move stuff. No game. I come back after 30 minutes, no game. Or I'll set an alarm on my clock for like 30 minutes in the future. And if it goes off, okay, leave the game. That is the number one reason why this game is going to die, if it's not dead already. And that will bring me into the point about balance. So there was 2 videos that I highly agree with that talk about balance a bit more in depth as to their views on the game. One is a more survivor view, and one is more of a demon view. With the demon view from Caddy TV, it's about a week ago, and then something game Marcos, I can't remember the YouTube channel's name. It's about an 18-minute long video around the same time frame, about a week ago, more survivor-sided, that explained very well both issues with the game in terms of balance. Marco's argument was that you don't want them to explain the balance of the game, you want them to explain the balance integrity. As in, how they're balancing the game is more important than the actual balance of the game. Which I agree with, but it's never going to happen for the reason he states. You piss off one side or the other. If you say what you're basing your balance of the game around, automatically half the community's going to split. And part of the reason why I've really just stopped playing multiplayer games in general is all of the video games that I've played now, or that competitive games I used to play, or try to play, are primarily the communities have gone to shit because it's us versus them. In this game, you have Survivor and Demon right at each other's throats. If one side gets a buff, the other side is immediately screaming about it. If one side gets a nerf, that side is immediately screaming about it. Which can be fair in some situations, but it ruins the ability to play the game, because Survivors and Demons both get entitled. And there are other games in my library that I've tried to play. I've been trying to play Pokemon Showdown, and everybody in that game has the mentality of they're there to win. They're not there to have fun. They're not there to have a competitive game. It's win as quickly as you can and move on to the next one. Win as quickly as you can, move on to the next one. And it's kind of similar in this. Overwatch is another great example. I played Paladins, Dead by Daylight, and Overwatch for years, and I dropped all 3 of those games. And all 3 of those games had a major issue that caused me to drop it, in terms of balance. All 3 of those games I dropped for balance reasons because, in Paladin's case, the game wasn't fun anymore because the more new characters that got introduced, the more overpowered they became. This game doesn't really have that problem. I don't think the new characters that they've introduced are broken by any means. They're, Plaguebringer is an annoying demon to go up against as a survivor, but it's not impossible to defeat. It's not impossibly hard to counter. The Blacksmith is a very strong survivor, but he can be heavily punished by some lineups. He gets heavily punished by RNG. David is on the weaker side. Nobody thinks David is a good survivor, except for those few die-hard David players who like his playstyle. Mia is kind of 50-50. Half the community thinks she's overpowered, best warrior in the game, and half the community thinks she's an average to garbage tier character, which I'm in that camp. So balance on that regard isn't here, which is what Paladins was pushing. Dead by Daylight's balance came down to the fact part of it was the community side, and part of it was just the over-tweaking of killers. All of the killers in that game had unique play styles. They had a variety of perks, but the higher up the food chain you went, the less competitiveness you saw. It just became kill as quickly as possible, and if it doesn't go your way in the first 5-10 minutes, you DC as a killer. And it kind of wastes, and in that game, you didn't get spirit points out of it. Like, if the killer DCs in this game, you get your spirit points out of it. You get the maximum amount of spirit points and XP. But in that game, killer DCs, whatever blood points you had at the time, that's what you got. You could de-pip You could lose ranking games where a killer DC'd right at the start of the game because you didn't get enough done if the game had gone on long enough. And then another example being Overwatch, where they just fundamentally did not understand how to balance that game. And when they changed, the balance started going downhill before the launch of Overwatch 2. Overwatch 2 basically killed my interest in going and playing that game. Just from a gameplay perspective, not even the monetization, the battle pass, the removal of game modes, the removal of features that were in Overwatch 1 that the community enjoyed. No. That didn't even do it for me. Just from a gameplay perspective, it had killed it. And I think this game is going to go down a similar trend. So let's talk a little bit about the balance and why I think the balance of the game is relatively fun. If you are a die-hard demon main that thinks that the demon role is underpowered because you go up against SWAT teams all the time, I'm not listening. You should click off now, or at least skip ahead for about 5 minutes. If you are a survivor main that is constantly a solo queue survivor, and you think that the survivor role, every survivor needs a buff, the roles need buffs, survivor is completely worthless if you're not playing in a 4-stack, I'm not listening to you. Click off now, skip ahead 5 minutes. Either of those options. The first issue that you have on the survivor side, you cannot balance the survivor side around either a SWAT squad or a solo queue squad. First off, playing as a solo queue survivor matters much more on 2 big factors: the character and role you pick, and if you have a mic and are able to communicate. Now, sometimes you are dealt a handicap as a survivor because you can pick a hard carry type like Warrior Ash and say, okay, I'm just going to play Warrior Ash, I can hard carry as long as someone keeps me alive, and the rest of your team either doesn't pick a support, loads up on more warriors, or nobody communicates. You could pick somebody like Pablo or the Blacksmith and be a very good solo queue support to keep your team alive, but the team doesn't play together, they don't share resources for you, they don't play into your playstyle, and thus, you lose the game. The survivors you get dealt as a solo queue survivor absurdly changes this. One thing I would do is if you queue as a solo queue player, you have to do a role queue. I would do something like that. I would implement a role queue. Now, this would enable the survivors. If you're a solo queue and you say, I want to play Warrior, you will get matched in a lobby with other characters. You could have 4 solo queues. You could have a leader / flex role. You could have a warrior only, a hunter only, and a support only. But the devs have not determined what their meta is. If they want one of everybody, if they want one of 3 classes and a flex that can pick anything, they want 2-1-1. They haven't addressed that, and that's part of the issue in balance. And if you were in a role queue, you automatically in a queue would get matched up against either a higher level demon, or you would have to pick roles ahead of time, similar to a role queue from something like Overwatch. The downside to this strategy is there's no player base to implement this. The player base is not large enough to implement this. Now, you can't balance around a SWAT line. Let's say you run a really good SWAT line. That's 4 survivors who are playing, who are on comms and communicate well, that know what they're doing in the game, that work well in the game, and pick good characters together. That's a lot harder to get unless you're a preset group. Let's say you pick like Cheryl, you bring Henry, you bring Warrior Ash, and then you're either bringing like an Arthur or a Hunter Ash, right? You got a SWAT lineup, you're covered. In my opinion, you cannot balance the game around the SWAT. The demon player has to understand that they are the power role. Just like the killer is the power role in Dead by Daylight, the predator is the power role in Predator Hunting Ground, mastermind is the power role in Resident Evil Resistance, the monster is the power role in Evolve, to a lesser degree, and the Jason player is the power role in Friday the 13th. Just as an example of asymmetricals that I've played. The power role is intentionally supposed to be strong. It is supposed to be able to 1v1 individual survivors, which is why the Uber Warrior mains that play nothing but Warrior or nothing but Hunter and talk about, oh my god, the demon needs to be nerfed because I can't 1v1 them anymore. That's not the demon's fault, that's your fault. You're supposed to work together. Now, the issue of demon is that being a newer demon feels much more punishing, or even just being a weaker demon feels much more punishing when you go up against a good SWAT squad. The problem is that a SWAT squad is supposed to be good if you think about it. Let's say you are running 4 Ashes. I'm not factoring prestige in when I talk about SWAT. Let's just say you're at four people here. That means that they are combined level 100, and you are combined level 45. This, obviously, is supposed to put you as a demon at a disadvantage. A SWAT squad should be winning more of those games. And you should have the option, as a demon, when you queue your demon, you pick your demon before you get into the queue, and you queue based on size, so to speak. So do you want to queue against a 4-stack, and the game gives you a spirit point boost, or the game gives you an extra threat level at the start of the game, or an extra skill point or 2, something like that? Or do you want to queue against a random lineup, which is not a preset lineup? The demon should have a role queue as well, similar to the survivor side. The problem as well is that the demon, most of the complaints that the demon players have is that the base mechanics of the survivors are broken. Now, I agree with that to an extent. Whereas the survivor argument is that individual demons that they have trouble with are problematic. That's why I disagree with. I think both sides' general overview is kind of bullshit. Now, there are examples. Puppeteer is oppressive and is not fun to play against because of the sheer speed of his units and the damage from puppet power. His power, Puppet Master, when he possesses a basic unit, basically guarantees that the survivor is going to eat a 4-hit heavy combo, and if they're not dead when he's in his chest thump animation, that is their one opportunity to either escape via car, kill him if they're a class that can kill him, or heal if they're a class that can't. And because you cannot fight him one-on-one, he can just focus down survivors one at a time and make it to where the survivors cannot play the game as soon as they're found. The rest of his kit is fine. The Demi-Elgos is one of the weaker elites in the game, most people say, but that just forces the demon player into basics. And the boss is annoying, but is not particularly threatening. He's hard to kill in terms of actually hitting him, but he's easy to kill because he's one of the squishier bosses. Comparingly, Warlord received a relatively decent rework. They kind of nerfed the power of her puke, but really they didn't need to do that. They just needed to remove the puke dodge cancel. And she's fine. She plays into her intended playstyle. She's a long, late-game killer. Her primary goal to winning a game is not downing survivors, it's killing the book. Her basic units are slower, they hit hard, and they can tank hits. Sometimes that works to the survivor's advantage, sometimes it works against their advantage. She can negate balance bar damage to her units when she pops her power, so she can prevent F-chaining. She doesn't have really high requirements to play. So a lot of demon players think she's the worst character in the game, but it's not that. It's just she has to play into her playstyle. And the demon players don't want to do that for the most part. They want to rush down the survivors immediately with some really cheap gimmicks and complain about things that make the game go on longer. I've seen some demons complaining about how it feels impossible to down survivors and they just have to go to the book stage, but every time I queue on Survivor, I don't know where these groups are that they're talking about unless I have a 4-stack, because the randoms that I get thrust in with do not understand how to play the game, or just turn me off of playing by getting on the mic and screaming obscenities about this not being done or that not being done. Like the Prestige 5 Scotty that decided a common sword was a better weapon than a purple lumberjack axe. Because he was a Prestige 5 and he knew what he was talking about. An example of that costs you a game. Because the Scotty then tried to 1v1 a puppeteer, and the Scotty proceeded to die, and thus, now, we had a hunter with a purple lumberjack axe who was trying to 1v1 a puppeteer because he had a lumberjack axe that was better than the gun that he had because of RNG. Because the survivor community in this game fails to understand that the survivors are only good in a squad, only good in a group of 4, knowing what they're doing and communicating. So, SWAT squads are the optimal way to play. The developers cannot force this mechanic. They cannot force a system where 4 survivors are forced to get together and queue together. That's going to kill the game further. So because of that, they can't balance the game around SWAT lineups, which means the SWAT lineups that exist are going to punish demon players. But the demon players need to understand that their power level is high enough to where a Plague Bringer is going to dominate a game because they can just build into elites and shut down half of the available weapons. If you're playing a warrior heavy lineup or you have a blacksmith and you're playing elite Plague Bringer, you've won the game before it even starts. They're not winning that matchup. There is no way for the survivors to win that matchup because now that means you don't have enough guns in play, you don't have enough gun damage in play to deal with him, and she can win just by draining your resources and draining you out. Similarly, if you're going up against a Necromancer, the Necromancer's strength is his ability to spam units. The more units he spams, the better chance he has of winning. Because of how aggressive the AI is, they can whittle you down without even possessing a unit. It becomes a situation where the survivors have to rush him, or they die. And if he's able to get enough units on the screen, and you have a bad internet connection, you can easily get a game crash, or a DC. It is not uncommon for that to happen. Which is part of the reason why my group has left. Puppeteer is the 1v1 machine. And if your team refuses to stick together, because they want to like split cap, or they want to one group wants to loot, one group wants to go get the objective, you've essentially lost the game because as soon as you split up, you die. The Warlord is a late game killer. She can be threatening early game. She's primarily going to be threatening you at the book because she can just tank hits and wear down the book. If you don't like that playstyle as a killer, you think she's terrible, but she's very good at what she does, and she can win earlier in a fight by just attacking survivors and wearing them down on resources. Now, demons say a lot of mechanics on the survivor side are unfair. Cars are unfair. The number of healing items in the game are unfair. Weapon rarity is unfair. To an extent, I would agree on weapon rarity. I think that the number of blues and purples in a game should be going up, because the amount of blues and purples I see are ridiculous compared to the number of legendaries. I can go a game without seeing a single blue or purple item, but that same game is either commons or legendaries, and nothing in the middle. I can have some games where I see no legendaries whatsoever, no purples, except for the one guaranteed purple box, and everything is commons and blues. As a survivor, that's not fun. I do think that the rarity on weapons should be downgraded a little bit, unless you have an Ed or a Hunter Ash. Those are the two exceptions. And that can then force them into the meta a bit more than they are right now. The bigger issue to me are resources. if your support doesn't have the resources after the first page and or dagger fight, you've lost the game. Because you don't have the opportunity to loot and get supplies. You need to do the next objective as quickly as possible. So if the rest of your team isn't dropping supplies, or you're a character that isn't capable of creating supplies, or bringing extra supplies in, you've essentially lost the game. In addition to that, some roles get utterly destroyed when it comes to combat. The support role, outside of the blacksmith because of his melee ability, deals no damage. Deals no damage. And they're not supposed to deal damage, but the problem is that support character still has to engage in combat. They still have to be able to defend themselves. The fact that most supports can't defend themselves is a problem in certain lineups. Let's say you're playing Cheryl. You're built into guns, you're trying to stay afar, you're paired up with two warriors, and both of your warriors are F-chaining like crazy. Meaning, you have to fight the possessed unit. You don't get an F-chain because your warrior Ash or your Scotty is taking your F-chains. That gets you killed, so now you can't heal the two of them, so as soon as their F-chain ends, they die. The survivor community is more toxic to each other than the demon is to the survivor. I think the balance of the game should be centered around four level 25 survivors, not prestiged, with blue weapons. That is what I would view the survivors at. That's what they should. I would not view them as a SWAT squad. I would view it as a 2-stack and a 2-stack, or a 2-stack and 2 solo queues. That's what the developers should be testing at. And the demon side, I think some of the demon mechanics need a nerf. But they also need a buff to balance them out. I think a lot of demons run into SWAT squads that are just bullshit. Where you can run into something like a support Ash or a Cheryl, who are two of the highest healing characters in the game. Cheryl's completely useless in combat, but Ash is slightly better in combat, but he's really not good. And they run into like a warrior Ash and a Henry. And that team never dies, because they have enough healing and they just tank through everything. And they get, well, those characters need a nerf. They really don't. Henry's tank power is balanced out by the fact that he does no extra melee damage compared to the other 3 warriors. He's the least damaging of the warriors, but he's the tankiest of the warriors. He's relatively balanced in that regard, especially after the nerf to his cooldown. Then you get a character like Scotty that has no defensive capabilities whatsoever. He's straight, I'm going to swing my axe and I'm going to kill everything in my way. Warrior Ash could use a little bit of a nerf, in my opinion. If I had to pick one survivor that needed a nerf, his combination is still too good together. I think removing the Chainsaw Mastery... I would switch the Chainsaw Mastery over to Leader Ash, and you could start Warrior Ash off with either starting the match with the Chainsaw, or... I would start with the match with the Chainsaw and the Boomstick, because that fits Army of Darkness. Because if you look, in Army of Darkness, he has the Chainsaw and the Boomstick. Those are the only 2 weapons he has at the start of the movie. Even though he technically loses the Chainsaw, and the Wizard has to drop it for him. So, I think that there are mechanics on the Survivor side that need to be tweaked. Obviously, David needs a buff, but I don't think buffing David is a simple answer. I think if you just fix the nail gun to where nail gun shots can pierce through enemies, that fixes nail gun, makes it a better weapon, makes it a better master. Similarly, I think some demons need some rework. The puppeteer's attacks should not interrupt survivors and stop them from attacking him if he's going to maintain any level of his puppet master. Or they need to significantly nerf the balance bar on his possessed units to make it possible to stun him in the middle of a combo. Otherwise, they need to nerf his damage on his puppet power. Simple as that. His elite units need a buff. his elite units need to have a self-destruct ability similar to what the basic unit does, where if you kill a Demi-Elgos with a melee attack, for example, it self-destructs, like the Berserker does. He has a resistance to ranged weapons, so you ideally want to fight him in melee. That would make sense to me. His Thunderstruck ability should have something in his skill tree. Call it Chain Lightning. I don't see anything here called Chain Lightning. Right? The way that Chain Lightning would work is if you pick up the ability, if you hit a survivor with lightning and another survivor that would be hit in that radius dodges, that lightning arcs off of any survivor hit to a survivor that wasn't hit. So it has a range limit to where you can hit survivors that dodge out the way. The boss could use a little bit of a buff. Damage reduction when he is when he's invisible, when he's moving. Damage reduction so that you can't just like track him as he's moving and pound him for damage. One thing that they could do to all of the individual units is that when they use their boss grab and they grab you, the survivor, instead of taking chunk damage, the survivor takes passive damage per second until they get freed by another survivor, unless they're the last remaining survivor. Then, the boss isn't allowed to use that grab on them, period. But then that would just insta-lock them. That would be better. That would force the team to help them. Meaning if the survivors try and split cap, and the demon jumps one group, and they force choke somebody, they're going to keep force choking him. They're going to keep doing the titty grab, whatever boss you have. They're going to keep grabbing that survivor and holding them in place, damaging them little by little, keeping them from doing anything, until another survivor does enough damage to free him. So if your other survivor's like, meh, I don't care, he can die, then he's going to be the next one that gets grabbed by that. Forces the survivors to work together. Coincidentally, the survivors need a little bit of a buff. Right now, there's no real mentality to keep the survivors together. Because if you split up into two groups of two, one group of two is going for objective, one group of two is looting. Whichever one the demon comes across, they can just DC right then and there as soon as they get caught and go down, and start their next game faster, and those two remaining survivors are kind of just stuck. There should be a passive bonus in play on the survivor side, where if the survivors are near a certain character, they get a buff. Similar to the aura roll on leader, but supports could have an aura, where any survivor that is in their healing range grants them, the support individually, a 5% damage reduction buff per survivor in their healing radius. The hunters could have something available to where they can convert a certain amount of ammo that they pick up that is not for the equipped type of gun they are using, and convert it to their ammo, so they don't have to worry about random players dropping. Warriors could have a functionality where their gun damage is boosted by 5% for each nearby survivor, which would help nerf the Plague Bringer a little bit. The Plague Bringer is the boss, so if the warriors all group up together, then they have better gun damage. The leaders could have something similar to this, where if survivors are in their aura, they all get a fear resistance bonus similar to leader Ash, so everybody's fear goes up slightly slower. Now, survivor nerfs that I think need to be made. Number one nerf that I think needs to be made is that I don't think the survivors should get rezzed after completing an objective. I think that their souls can appear at an objective when it's been completed, but they shouldn't get auto-res. They should still have to go over and res. That gives the demon more time to catch up to them, because what happens now is, let's say you're split capping, Leader Ash and Warrior Ash go down to point A, but Hunter Ash and Support Ash cap point B. The demon is on their way over to point B to the Hunter and the Support, and what ends up happening is the objective pops, Leader Ash and Warrior Ash get rezzed, so now there's a 4 stack, they go to the objective,
And they're able to get there before the demon does, in some cases. Sometimes they can't. And because now you have a 4-stack at that objective, they win. And it makes all of the work that the demon did to get Leader Ash and Warrior Ash down mean nothing. What should happen is, instead of their 2 souls being trapped at point A, which would then be impossible for the survivors to res, their souls get transported to the objective B that completed, the Hunter and Support Ash are at, but they would still have to manually go and res them. That would give either the demon time to attempt to intercept them at the res, or it would give them time to go redefense the objective. I do think cars can be overpowered if you misuse them, but they're more harm than good. People really say Pablo's a shit character because he's stealthy. Those are the same people that don't understand how stealth in this game works. If you get into a car, if you fall from a great height and your character makes an type of noise when they land, if they fire their gun, or if they let their fear get too high, the demon gets an alert on their minimap where they are. Except for Pablo. So survivors that jump into cars at the beginning of the game, except for Pablo, have essentially killed the ability to do that. Same thing if they fire their guns early. Now, fear takes a bit more time, so fear I'm not too worried about. But that costs you more games than any other thing, than anything else, as a survivor, if the demon finds you too early. So cars really can work against the survivor. In addition to that, a lot of survivors aren't good at fighting their way out of situations because they're so used to, oh no, I'm a hunter, I'll just fire my 2 shots, and instead of reloading, I'll jump into the car and drive away. Well, when the demon takes away your car, you then can't win most of the time when you rely on that. But I think cars are a bit too oppressive. A mechanic that I would put into the game is that the demon has the ability to trap cars. They can put a fear trap on a car. Or they can have a jack-in-the-box type thing, where you can plant a jack-in-the-box in the car. What happens is the survivors, after a few seconds of driving the car automatically kicks the survivors out of the car and just drives in a straight line down the road at top speed for 5 seconds, or until it hits an object. And it would prevent the car from being possessed for like 10 or 15 seconds. Some new mechanics on the demon side would buff them out more. I think some new mechanics on demon and survivor side would really help balance the game more than anything else. Another thing I would prefer would be something like matchsticks, where the survivors have the ability to use matches on chests or on traps and burn the trap out. Meaning, if it's used on like a static trap, like a tree trap or something like that, they can just light a match and burn that trap, and the demon can't use it for the rest of the game. Or they could use it to like remove a trap off of a chest. Demons, a mechanic I would love to see demons have, is the ability to upgrade their units more in a game. Currently, the Warlord is a great example of this. Currently, the Warlord has an ability on her basics where they can rip their arms off and use them as melee weapons if they don't spawn with an axe. The way I would change this mechanic is that your basics and elites, as you upgrade their portal, they get better weapons. So you could have basic units where you can upgrade the portal 5 times with your threat level. At threat level 1 and 2, they have just a basic hand axe. At threat levels 2 and 4, or at threat levels 3 and 4, you can call it stage 2 of this, they get a better weapon, like they get a mace. And then at threat levels, or your upgrade 4 and 5 on the tree, you then get like a better weapon. Like if they hit portal level 5, they get a sword, right? That could be one way to upgrade the unit's damage over the course of a game, rather than just strictly increasing the numbers. There's a lot of mechanics that can be done, but in my opinion, the first thing that has to be done is the matchmaking. because the matchmaking between survivors is terrible, and the matchmaking between the waiting times of games is terrible. That's going to kill the game more than anything else. And as much as I would like to say, this side needs a buff, this side needs a nerf, it's much easier said than done. And as much as I would like to say, oh, well, what you need to do is you need to declare how you're balancing the game. That's just going to alienate the community and separate it further. I think the recognition has to come from the community in terms of balance. I've played Dead by Daylight. I'm not going back to play that game. That game has no balance whatsoever anymore. And part of the reason is because Dead by Daylight's keeping their game afloat by just throwing new DLC. Every time they have a dip in the player base, they go out and they get a big license. Pyramid Head really kicked this trend off in Dead by Daylight, where every time the game starts to die, new license. You got Pyramid Head. Oh, great. Okay, that'll get people going. And then the next one was Sadoko, which really didn't work out the way they wanted to. But then you had the 2 Resident Evil DLCs. And now you had the Knight, which is a For Honor one. It's not a big deal, but, I mean, it is kind of a licensed killer, so to speak. They just use their releases to do that. Now, Evil Dead has not shown a willingness so far to go outside the Evil Dead license, even though I think you could pretty easily get Freddy or a Jason. You could pretty easily do something with more of a niche indie type killer. You could get Slenderman, you could get a Springtrap if you want to do a FNAF level. You could do stuff like that. But the genre as a whole is probably going to start to wither away and die out. And I think that the game in this game is going to die out. More because of the community not agreeing on balance and chasing each other away. And matchmaking just making it so that the players that are here eventually trickle out, kind of like I am. I've been playing Inscription pretty much religiously for the past 2 days, as opposed to sitting in queue for 30 minutes on Evil Dead. And the sad part is, this video has been 42 minutes long. I'm about to end it here. This video has been more productive to me in 42 minutes than the 30 minutes I would have to wait in a queue right now for a 12-minute game that would end in either me DCing, 2 survivors on my team DCing because it's a puppeteer, or us just dying immediately. So,